Hello again, and welcome to the final video in this series about how to make your own striped fur jacket out of Simplicity pattern 8741. The last two videos got us to this point where we have all of our fabric cut and ready to sew. I'm using a scrap of the lining fabric to test my stitch length and tension. This fabric is pretty flimsy, so I'm loosening the tension and shortening the stitch length until it doesn't pucker up anymore. Now, just like we did with the fit sample, I'm going to pin and sew the sleeves, shoulders, and side seams. On one of the side seams, I'm only going to sew a few inches at the top and a few inches at the bottom, leaving a large opening at the side. Press your seams open, including the side seam with the opening. Now flip the sleeves so they're right side out and keep the body of the lining inside out. Pin the sleeves into the arm's eye, matching seams, notches, and drill hole markings, just like we did for the fit sample. Sew the sleeves into the lining and then set it aside while we put the fur pieces together. I'm going to trim away the pile from the seam allowance for each of the fur pieces. Using a pointed scissor, dig the blade into the fur and carefully cut the pile away, leaving the backing fabric and just a short stubble of fur. I only cut in about 1/4 inch to 3/8. I try not to cut the entire 1/2 inch seam allowance away because I don't want to have any bald spots at the seams. You might be thinking, wow, that sounds like a big pain in the yeah, it is. After an hour or two of that, all of my pieces are trimmed and I can sew them together more easily. Starting with the front pieces, pin 2 pieces together, matching the stitch line. Notice I'm not matching the tips of the fabric, I'm matching a 1/2 inch down where the stitching is going to be. Sew the fur pieces together one piece at a time. You'll probably need to increase the stitch length a little to help it through the machine. Press each seam open with the press cloth as it's sewn. I have my iron on the wool setting. Test some fur scraps to make sure they can handle the heat. When you get to the pieces with the chevron, pin the edges and the center of the points together at the stitch line. When you sew these pieces together, stop with the needle down right at the point intersection. Raise the presser foot and use a small scissor to snip into the seam allowance at the V, up to about 1/8 inch away from the needle. Now you can pivot the pieces and continue sewing. Then trim away the seam allowance of the other side of the V so you can press it open. Soon you will have completed jacket sections again, and you can pin the sleeve inseams, shoulders, and side seams. Pin near the start of each stripe to match them at the seams. By now the seams are getting pretty thick, so I'm pressing the fabric firmly against the needle plate to try to compress it and help the machine take it in. I also increased my stitch length again. Press the seams open, then flip the sleeves right side out and pin them into the arm's eye. Reference the pattern if your marks have wiped off like mine did. Take your time sewing the sleeves into the body. Stitch slowly and help feed the fabric into the machine without forcing it. Now that our piles of fur resemble a jacket, try it on and see how you like it so far. I decided the plain sleeve cap breaks up the stripe of the shoulder too much, so I'm going to add a little green tip to continue the stripe. I'm opening up the sleeve, measuring where the stripe should start and end, checking it against the pattern and spacing from the other stripe, and splitting the difference so it's not too far off from the rest of the pattern. Then I marked out the pattern on the sleeve cap, added seam allowance, and cut the excess. Then I cut the piece from the green fur, pinned, and stitched it on each sleeve cap. I closed the sleeve back up and voila, unbroken stripe. Another thing I decided on was to have the center front butt together instead of overlap like the pattern suggests. So I tried it on and pinned the front back until it met comfortably. Now I'm pinning through the fold so I can take out the pins and mark the true center front. It's about 1 1/4, so I'm marking that on both sides of the front. Now we can pin the lining into the jacket. Pin along the neckline, center fronts, and hem, matching the seams. I taped the front pattern pieces back together so I could mark exactly where the stripes should be hitting on the lining. This way they'll line up when it's sewn. I'm also marking where I want the hooks and eyes to go. Hooks on your right side, eyes on your left. I want to insert them into the lining instead of sewing them on top of the fabric, which is something I've never done before. Sew the lining and jacket body together, and when you get to the marks for the hooks, stop stitching 1/8 inch before the mark and back tack. Then start stitching again 1/8 inch below the mark, being sure to back tack again. On the left front piece, you want to leave 1/4 inch on each side of the mark because the eyes are larger than the hooks. I didn't do that, so I had to go back and restitch each opening. Learn from my mistake. Now I can trim away the extra fabric at center front and trim the fur back in the seam allowance. Also, snip the corners down to about 1/8 inch away from the stitch line. You can also snip the seam allowance out of the seams to reduce bulk. And then go ahead and snip the seam allowance at the curve of the neck so it can fold back without puckering. I'm going to serge the neck and hem so the seam allowance is nice and tight. I'm also going to push the lining aside at center front and serge just the fur. I leave long tails from the serger and then use a blunt needle with a large eye to thread the tails through the serged edge to finish it. I like a lot of control on my seams, so I'm going to hand sew the seam allowance at the neckline down onto the body and the right center front where the hooks will line up. Now we can start inserting the hooks. It's going to be hard to sew the hooks into the jacket, so use some binding tape looped through the hook to make it easier. Slide the hook through the opening in the seam so that it's hooked through the lining like this. Feel or look inside to position it at the edge of the jacket and then pin the tape to the fur backing. After they're pinned, you can hand sew them in place. On the other side, I'm inserting the eye, and then I'm going to hand tack in the middle of the seam so it doesn't pull back into the jacket and get lost. Then I'm positioning it so that it sticks out about 1/4 inch and sewing it into the seam allowance of the jacket. After those are sewn, you can sew the entire center front down. Now let's sew the sleeve hem. First, hand sew the edge of the shoulder seams of the lining onto the shoulder seams of the fur. Then turn the jacket right side out using the hole in the lining. Work it slowly so you don't pop any stitches. I use my thumbs to push the fabric through, starting from one side to the other. Once you've got it flipped, push the lining into the sleeves. Reach your arm into the sleeve and feel the seam of the lining to make sure it's not twisted. Then fold the edges of the fur and lining down inside the jacket and reach through the hole in the lining to grab those edges. Pull them through the hole without losing hold. Now pin them together and around the rest of the sleeve opening. Repeat for the other sleeve and sew them together. Then go ahead and serge them too. Try the jacket on and see how it's looking. I like to adjust the sleeve length and hem so it's laying nice. Then pin at the seam and hand sew the seam allowances down like we did at the neck and center fronts. Now there are just a few little finishing details left. I want to do a swing tack at the underarm seams, so get a needle and thread and knot the thread so that it's doubled over. Stitch through the underarm seam on the fur and knot the thread. Then begin another stitch, put your fingers through the loop, and grab the thread from the needle. Pull that thread through the loop and tighten the loop around it, creating a new loop. You're making a chain stitch. Keep pulling and tightening new loops until you have about 1/2 inch of chain. Then put the needle through the last loop to tie it off. Knot this around the underarm seam allowance of the lining. Repeat for the other side of the jacket. Now we just need to close the lining at the side seam that we had left open. You can do this on a machine, but I usually prefer to do it by hand. Make little stitches through the folded edges of the lining, overlapping into the machine stitching a little to secure it, then knot it off. Give the lining a quick press with a press cloth and enjoy your new jacket! I hope this tutorial has been fun to watch and that you've learned a few things from it, even if it's only that you never want to make this jacket. But hopefully you can at least take some of these techniques and put them to use in your own projects. If you've enjoyed these videos, please give them a like and subscribe to my channel so you can see the next fun stuff I've got coming up.